Greetings and welcome, everyone. I am Maurita Poole, the Director and Curator at Clark Atlanta University Art Museum. It is my pleasure to serve as the moderator for the panel titled From Decorative to Mutant Objects. This panel will highlight scholarly and curatorial perspectives on the context for the production of African art, the implications of historic and contemporary structures of power, and the conceptual and working strategies of contemporary African artists. Before our presenters begin, there are a few rules of engagement that I would like to share with our viewers, particularly for those who may not have attended the earlier sessions today. During the presentation of Emmanuel Charel, a simultaneous translation into English will be available. If you wish to hear it, click on the interpretation button, which will appear at the bottom of your screen, and select English. Also, during the question and answer session, there will be consecutive translation with an on-screen interpreter to help facilitate the discussion. Viewers can ask panelists questions using the question and answer function of Zoom by clicking on the button Q&A at the bottom of their screen and by typing their questions. Now, I will present our speakers, beginning with Lauren Tate Baeza, not necessarily in order of their presentations, but based on their last names. So, Lauren Tate Baeza is the Fred and Rita Richmond Curator of African Art at the High Museum of Art. She oversees an exemplary collection of African masks, sculpture, textiles, beadwork, and ceramics. She previously served as Director of Exhibitions at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, where she curated the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. collection and organized numerous temporary exhibitions using the visual arts to engage social issues. Baeza speaks, lectures, and consults at universities, nonprofit organizations, and federal departments on a range of cultural and socio-political topics related to Africa and the African diaspora. She will be our second presenter. Our first presenter will be Emmanuelle Charel, Dr. Emmanuelle Charel, who is an art historian who works at, please excuse my French if it's not well pronounced, the École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture de Nantes. Her research focuses on the political dimensions of art and the ways artistic production is situated or constructed within historical realities. A full professor at the Beaux-Arts Nantes Saint-Nazaire, who is responsible for the Dakar campus, she has led research projects, Pensée Archipélique, Pensée depuis la frontière, and since 2019, workshops of epistemological disorders with El Haj Malik Njai. Welcome, and without further ado, I will pass the screen to Emmanuelle for her presentation. And thank you very much. English and French are available, both, not only English. Both languages are available for translation.
Merci beaucoup, Maurita. Bonjour à tous. Je suis ravie de partager ce moment avec vous. Donc, mon intervention va s'intituler...
So, my contribution will be called The Metamorphical Life of African Masks. In the fields of art of African arts, masks are exemplary and emblematic. They're admired for their incredible aesthetic, for their forms, their volumes, but also for the African or Western imaginations that they've elicited. Masks are omnipresent in collections and exhibitions devoted to the art of the continent. Their history is now connected to colonization and particularly to the values and myths of the Western history of art. In galleries and museums in Europe and North America, but also in Africa, the presentation in display cases shows the control exerted by Europeans on the territories, the minds, and the bodies of the African continent. For more than a century, presented naked, isolated, and stripped of their costumes and accessories, but also often stripped of a specific history of their production within the diverse societies and cultures that generated them, masks have been subjected to a process of de-anthropalization of images that fits into the context of the modernist narrative of the history of art. In other words, either the museum uses ethnography, the consequence of which is purging these objects of their sacred character by substituting labeling to their experience, or it pushed aside any spiritual and social dimension by basing itself on aesthetic excitement. Thus, over the course of the 20th century, their transformation from ritual objects into works of art and merchandise has led to defining masks as paradoxical objects. They have been introduced into a network of interactions and mediations, activating different levels of varied and somehow concurrent values due to the interconnection of processes of commodification, cultural valorization, and artification, caught in an inevitable tension induced by the displacement of their original context and that of the exhibition. These attributes are nonetheless endowed with a reality that has been called mask, whether for good or wrong, and that now accompanies them in museums. Some observers have noted that their functions now are like hypotheses, for we cannot really know today their historical, cultural context of appearance and their representations. In the ancient religions of Africa, these masks are manifested in the context of staged performances in different codified symbolic stage pictures. They're worn and evolve spatially in a movement with music, songs, movement, dance, acrobatics. They are composed of composite substance that only take on their meaning and function in the formal and semantic relationship created by their assembly. Secular and carnivalesque masks, but especially sacred masks, are like extensions of the body. They appear in a ceremony or a festival to present aspects of society, to watch over, to protect, ward off threats, conflicts, diseases, catastrophes, and also allow for public and collective expression of joy. Guardians of institutions held by members of secret societies, they are instruments of political pressures. They possess more or less hidden significances, whether one is an initiate or not, and according to the rites with which they are associated, agrarian, funerary, or initiation. Through their metaphysical dimension that is conferred upon them, they can thus affirm different values, ensuring the mediation between the living and the dead, the visible and the invisible. Today, still, their magic religious uses depend of geographic zones and cultures. Masks have been analyzed as vectors, intercessors, charged objects, strong objects, concrete mediators in social processes, and they're also seen as holders of powers and a spiritual aura that is mysterious and that can be attenuated once their secret is revealed. A mask must remain a mask. It is not a simple object, says one Beninese practitioner. Thus, the mask is not meant to reveal what it dissimulates. It must preserve the secret of the strength it holds in. Another manner of dealing with these objects is therefore to go beyond significances that are attached to them and the selected aesthetic criteria, to consider that these objects are agents endowed with a delegated social intentionality and therefore have an effect on their environment. In other words, they must be considered in a praxeological perspective rather than a semantic one, and considered as an art object that allows for cognitive operations. In 2015, Philip de Scola wrote, "An active intentionality can be attributed by humans to an entity that is non-human, but endowed with what can be inferred by abduction as a capacity to act intentionally, analogous to that of humans. In this regard, one credits masks with an intentional autonomy, an ability to act by its own means, sometimes linked to techniques of activating and deactivating objects." Today, masks are a living heritage with a complex status, caught in a network of players with tangled interests. For example, the interconnection between the processes of commodification and artification engaged in Western commercialization. I'm talking about Western art dealers who are working with collectors, is also at work in the work of West African antiquarians and in the way that they are found, that they're forced on site to deal with the ambivalence of the status of these objects and their gaze upon the local population on their work. This conference deals with the work of the artists Hervé Youmbi and François Knut, who each question in their own way the status of African masks today, their functions, where they appear through the conception of what I call new mutant objects. This contribution, as you'll see, suggests considering other ways of understanding the objects of collections known as African art through their active power, such as that of the artist Jo Awakam, who works in the Laboratoire Agit Art at Dakar and says, how do we materialize in museums the historical facts that represented epistemological breaks that were very important within African societies and that African memory has preempted? To date, most of us are convinced that the spirits of the ancestors are a reality. It is alive, the dead are not dead. But how in our museums am I going to reflect these dead who are not dead and who speak to me, who I see in dreams, who protect me? All this shows us that we have problems to determine the new type of museum that we need. We must therefore create a new museum manifesto. In an article entitled Museum of the Mutants, the philosopher Suleiman Bashir Dian also underlines the manifestation of the power that certain objects known as so-called African art have, and that gather in a single and one rhythmic attitude the metamorphosis that is still taking place and that defines life, and it expresses a cosmology of emergence, a cosmology that still aims to a great abundance of life. To say that the object mutant draws its significance from this cosmology is to understand that it recaps in it the creative flow. Objects of African art are these mutants that do not stay in one place and are always excessive. So from 2010 to 2004, the Cameroonian artist Hervé Youmbi launched two projects, Totems and Visage de Masque. These are projects that are being built over several years, and these realizations, installations are still underway. With Totems and Visage de Masque, Faces of Masque, Youmbi is taking on the structural violence of the art market, institutions, and practices that it generates. In other words, the capitalist system that it underpins. These projects explore the status of magic ritual objects, of merchandise and artworks that are African masks, and the monetary value notions, commodification notions, and fetishization notions that are associated with this. Complex, interconnected, subject to debate, these notions are at the heart of his work, which generates a productive and ambiguous entanglement. Visage de Masque was showed in a first exhibition in Cameroon in 2015. In a center forming a labyrinth, there were several wood crates that were standing and lying down, identical to the ones that museums use to transport art objects. On each of them was pinned a photograph of an artwork illustrating classical African art. Masks that had become icons, totems, in the canons of Africanist history of art, and that belonged to the National Museum of African Art, the Metropolitan, the Brooklyn Museum, or the Quai Branly Museum at Paris, institutions that all played a crucial role in the construction of this canon. Under each image, one saw a museum label indicating the provenance of the mask, its date, its materials, and its history in the collection. The arrangement of the wood crates echoed that of tombstones in a cemetery. Viewers were invited to remember that the majority of the objects had been stolen by Europeans or bought, and that in their hands, in European hands, they became inanimate, dead, as Chris Marker and Alain René would say. Above the labyrinth of wood crates was suspended a circle of masks conceived by Youmbi and realized in collaboration with sculptors and pearl artists artists from the grassland region in the west of Cameroon, a region reputed for its extraordinary culture. According to an article, during funeral ceremonies which Yumbi witnessed in the region, he noticed the use of plastic masks, objects made in China to be used in North America during Halloween. Some of these masks reproduce the mask of the ghost serial killer in the horror film Scream, 1996, which is itself inspired by the famous painting The Scream, painted by Edvard Munch in 1893. These plastic masks enter into the powerful dance ceremonies next to masks for which the region has long been known, notably elephant caps consisting of long panels of beaded fabric. In other words, while the canons in the West applied to classic African art insist on a precise separation of styles and regional affiliations, Yumbi scrambles these categories into a disjunctive and syncretic style. He challenges a vision that has long made disappear the permanent aesthetic changes of these objects, and that tried to establish fixed identities that are far from the historical realities of the continent. By scrambling these categories, he creates this disjunctive and syncretic style that aims to make the permanent aesthetic changes of the region disappear, replacing them with fixed identities that are far from the continent's historical realities. In 2015, one could also see casts of masks that Yumbi had bought in Douala's markets and that had been made by craftsmen who are working for tourists. Therefore, this gesture was mixing the distinctions between art and craft, traditional and modern, authentic and commercial. It was blurring these distinctions. And these are distinctions that play a crucial role in the production of market value of African masks. What is particularly interesting in Yumbi's work and what characterizes it is that the artist has decided that the mask in the installation in 2015 should have a complex life cycle. After this first stage of their existence, in the context of a conceptual contemporary artwork within a white cube, there was a second stage. The works then entered into the ritual life of the Grassfields region. Here, they became the possession of Kunang initiates who, through their participation in danced rituals, quote unquote, activate them. Thus, the work of art, conceptual art, is transformed into objects of power that are spiritually charged. On March 30, 2015, in the village of Dakpoji, in the district of the chiefdom of Banja, the initiate Kungan Herve Yamgwen appeared in a ceremonial garb wearing one of the masks from Yumbi's project. In a third stage, in late 2015, the mask conceived by Yumbi was activated by Yamgen, was exhibited at the Contemporary African Art Fair, an event in London that participated in the success of contemporary African art on the international market. In this context, Yumbi and Axis, his New York gallery, developed a display entitled Two-Faced Mask that revealed the aspects of the mask's previous two lives. On the wall, a label described the sculpture as an anthropological artifact. Descriptions which were in contradiction with the shipping documents pinned to the crates that said contemporary mask, work of art for exhibition, and stipulated that the object was neither an antiquity, neither recognized or categorized as cultural property. So there was another fourth stage, and in this stage, Yumbi decided to have his objects sent back to Cameroon to reintegrate them into the Kungang universe. But that they would go back once again to Europe or the United States to be sold. In that case, the mask would go back to Cameroon again, where it would be ritually deactivated. Then it would be returned to its new owner, which means that the owner would, him or herself, be involved in an unusual back and forth, which is unique in the cycle of extraction and acquisition, which has historically marked the entrance of works of art produced in Africa in Western collections. Finally, the mask was bought by the Royal Ontario Museum, an institution known for its collections and its institutional critique, notably launched by Sylvia Forney. In an article, Forney examined the interweaving of the project Visage in historically dense networks of production and exchanges of existing art in the Grassveld, and directly and indirectly connecting the west of Cameroon to a large range of players throughout Africa, as well as in Europe and North America. So what we see is that at each movement, the hybrid mutant objects by Hervé Youmbi acquire a new status. Layers of new meaning accumulate, leading to the appearance of shifting objects, a term I borrow from Dominique Malaquais, which are impossible to categorize in the dichotomies that have long structured the way in which material and cultural production from Africa has been analyzed, exhibited, and commercialized. In other words, each sculpture embodies and precipitates an ontological crisis. In this article, Playing in the Market, Hervé Youmbi and the Art World Maze, Dominique Malaquais shows that Youmbi's position is double-edged. Revealing the totally artificial dichotomies, Youmbi, that are applied to these masks, Youmbi simultaneously exploits these dichotomies. He appropriates them. He creates meta objects that are both original and copies, real and fake, traditional and modern, ritual and conceptual. So I found some of these questions in a recent film, which was made by Zina Sarawiwa and called Worrying the Mask, which deals with this question in a totally different way, but it's interesting to see it. Now I'm going to talk about another mutant mask, which is entirely different. This is from the film installation Core Dump Dakar, a project by the South African artist François Knuts. Composed of a series of 4 films, Kinshasa, Shenzhen, New York, and Dakar, and of digital detritus, this installation explores the relationship between digital technologies, cybernetic technologies, neocolonialism, and the re-enchanted version of a humanist utopia that is non-aligned, gaining on visions of transhumanism spread by Silicon Valley. Each film weaves connections beyond the geographic and temporal discontinuities by calling on Marxist and Pan-African utopias of the African cinema from the beginning, and also the thought of Donna Haraway, Sylvia Wynter, Gayatri Spivak, Frantz Fanon, and Aimé Césaire, among many others. Core Dump Dakar, I'm having an image problem. Here we go. So Core Dump Dakar, which lasts 11 minutes and 50 seconds, is the story of a man whose face has been burned following the explosion of an old TV monitor. In order to protect his body, which has become monstrous, the character in the film puts on an astronaut suit. His space combination, his body and spacesuit that's patched up with burlap, is loaded with motherboards, the entrails of deconstructed computers, which are connected to multiple electronic circuits. Faced with his helmet, in order to hide his face, is a wood mask, a copy of an ancient mask. With this retro-futurist gear and through a performative action, the man wanders through the streets of Dakar as if locked into his suit, his breathing marked by a form of asphyxia. His electronic voice changes into a feminine voice. He says, I circulate through electronic circuits as well as in the streets of Dakar. I repair myself. I recreate myself. I am not a prisoner of history. I have understood that by impressing data in the DNA of my flesh, I am able to stock more information in a hair than an entire data center. I have decided to take myself in hand and to become my own object. So the film draws the spectator into a parallel world seen through the eyes of this astronaut and into a fanciful narrative, a fiction with a Baroque low-tech aesthetic that has an often very dark humor, caustic humor. On the one hand, this disfigured and disintegrating figure reminds us of the situation of the colonized body that has notably been studied by Frantz Fanon and more recently by Achille Mbembe. Mbembe would say it is the body of the Negro who has become monster and fossil through the forced labor and humiliations. To produce the Negro is to produce the social link of subjection and the body of extraction. That is to say, a body that is completely exposed to the will of the master and of which one attempts to obtain the maximum profit. This is a situation that has lasted on and on with the specific situation of extractive capitalism, and it continues to this day to remove a certain number of necessary minerals for new technologies from the African continent, including cobalt, copper, coltan, and that shamefully exploits the workforce of humans. This disfigurement, the explosion that marks here the violence and the scandal, expresses an anger in the face of predatory successive regimes that sweep societies away in the name of industrialization to serve global mass consumption. Francois Knudts challenges digital economy, which is often presented as the promise of a desirable future. He questions the conditions of its production, the plundering of resources and the conflicts on the continent to have access to the minerals in order to satisfy the world's electronic hunger, notably in the West. And also the trash that is discharged, the electronics that are dumped in Africa, and which is illegal to dispose of in the West and is then sold and resold in Africa. These rejects often find up in landfills, poisoning bodies. However, this is also an ambivalent figure. The astronaut suit, which refers since the 1960s to the conquest of an extraterrestrial other place, the dream of new explorations, here it represents an African cyborg, a figure symbolizing a critical utopia of categorizations, to speak like Donna Haraway. Here, it refers to the possibility of a reinvention of self tensed by contradictions. For example, our imagination of space conquest is more than ever today fed by the logics of extractivist capitalism, as well as African spatial ambitions, which go back to 1964, but have been reaffirmed in 2019. But these are also problematic. In 2019, the African Union confirmed the creation of an African space agency that should coordinate the continent's spatial strategy. The astronaut in core dump The astronaut in core dump, allied with the replica of an ancient mask, also brings up another dimension of this figure. This one is found in a complex time marked by overlapping temporalities, past, present, future. This question of time, of the relation to the past, is reinforced by the appearance of an other element, a third mask. This one is made of resin. This third mask is in fact added on top of the cosmonaut's helmet, and it is a kind of prosthesis that works as a projection surface, a screen on which videos of different faces are projected. And these faces are taken from audiovisual archives whose speech gives extra depth to the narrative, which is, these are the visuals that we see in the film that accompany the character. Now we'll see how the image of a certain number of people appears on his resin mask. In fact, the resin mask seems to me to participates in expressing the process of reassembling parts of bodies and cultures, African bodies and cultures that have been amputated, and to repair broken links. This device, which gives the figure of Coeur Dakar a kind of dystopian science fiction vibe, contributes to a reinscription in history by calling on numerous references. It allows for an invocation of ancestors, notably those who fought for independence, in order to pick up on and call on a genealogy of the non-aligned who can participate in the construction of the future. These include the filmmaker Djibril Diop Mambéty. There's also the powerful speech by Ousmane Sembène in his film against Africa's financial and food dependence. And finally, he refers to the speech by Léopold Sédar Senghor in the Conference of the Non-Aligned in Dakar in 1975. And we hear Mamadou Dia condemn the continent's new dependencies. So the projections of these faces on the wax mask make manifest other possible interactions between beings and things, other active principles in the heart of the real. So the low-tech cyborg character in Core Dump speaks with the spirits of the ancestors and participates in a treatment process by showing the wounds and the healing function of the performance of bodies and narratives. In the way of science fiction, it is not satisfied to re-image our present through a mirror that is deformed, but tries to reimagine it otherwise. So François Knudts therefore generates a paradoxical image that, it seems to me, also touches upon a murky zone provoked by digital. One could say that Westerners, by massively investing in the technologies of cognition and information, have fantasized another form of metempsychosis in which humankind would be diluted into masses of atoms, into a space communicating by radiation and turning into light. So there's a kind of dream of the noosphere up to the omega point, in which dematerialization becomes a kind of instantaneous telepathic communion, a fusion of consciousness in a supercognition, and a kind of moment of cosmicological apotheosis. In any case, as Achille Mbembe says it, the African continent is plunged into a rather similar movement. This is what he writes. African pre-colonial cultures were obsessed by questions on the limits of the earth, of life, of the body, and of self, like their myths, their oral literature, and their cosmogonies show us. Among the most important human questions, there were those that concerned the world beyond the perceptible, the corporeal, the visible, and the conscious. Objects were not seen as static entities. They were rather like flexible and living beings, gifted with magical, original, and sometimes occult properties. They were keepers of an energy, a vitality, and a virtuality, and as such, they constantly invited themselves to the transmutation and even transfiguration. These tools, technical objects, and artifacts thus belong to a world of interfaces and in such, they served as thresholds from which the existing limits were transgressed in order to access the infinite horizons of the universe. According to Memembe, the digital objects reactivate this way of imagining things. To finish, I'd like to suggest that the image proposed by Cordump Descartes generates a paradox, a visual paradox that in a single figure allows various references and cultures to emerge. But more specifically, what interests me is that the figure of the low-tech cosmonaut seems to extend in its own way a history of sculpture. Perhaps it reenacts the concept of sculpture in certain parts of Africa. I'm thinking, for instance, of the altars to ancestors in Burkina. That is an incarnation of the network of human relations constantly repeated, linking an ancestor to a descendant through an artifact inhabited by a human, neither entirely dead nor entirely alive, and thus equipped with its own agency, of which only the prophylactic, vindictive, or healing effects are perceptible, as Descola has suggested. And so from my point of view, it's this figure of Cordump with all the different elements that compose it is an eminent agent of collective life. Thank you very much.
Okay, Emmanuelle, thank you for your presentation, and now we'll hear from Lauren. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Lauren Tate Baeza. I'm the newly appointed Curator of African Art at the High Museum of Art, and I'm happy to join this day of programming and conversations with experts across many fields on masks and their functional and symbolic meanings over time, geographies, and cultures. Thank you for having me. Today, I'm just going to speak for about 20 minutes about two areas that are of particular interest to me and which I feel are underexplored in my field. And these are things that I've been looking into and querying since starting my post just a few months ago. I've only recently begun interrogating these ideas, and it is my pleasure to share some of the critical prompts and initial observations I've made on these topics today, each of them highlighting African agency. The first topic I'd like to discuss is misinformation produced through different modes of obfuscation. And the second set of topics I'd like to explore are notions of traditional and made for sale art in African collections, and how and why each term is assigned. To begin part one of this discussion regarding obscuring, I'd like to tell a story a friend of mine relayed to me. My friend is an accomplished artist from Congo, Kinshasa, and his matrilineal heritage has its origins in the eastern part of the country. Once, when he was traveling in South Africa for a residency, he went to the museum library. And it was at an institution that is very much the legacy of Dutch and British colonization in the country. While at the library, he searched the computer terminals and discovered the library possessed a colonial era book of his mother's ethnic group. And so, excited, he goes to recover the book. He retrieves it, he sits down, and he opens it up and is confronted with this picture with a caption identifying the persons in the image as the king in his court. Immediately, my friend says, "That's not my king." Of course, being of this group and having intimate knowledge of its customs, he instantly recognized that the man pictured was not wearing the proper adornments. He was wearing improper garments for a king. The body of the woman said to be the king's wife was absent of all proper scarifications a queen would have, and so on. But this was published in a book, still available for checkout, in this reputable institution where people seek knowledge, information, and truth, some 5,000 kilometers away from the ancestral home of the people represented. The story is very important and teachable for many reasons, but I'll share just one idea for today. And that is that one can imagine colonial era anthropologists and geographers requesting to be taken to the king, and my friend's people wanting to protect their king from these foreigners, unsure of their intentions, or perhaps having seen firsthand their violence, intentionally bringing forward the wrong person. In many African societies, secrecy is power. Therefore, many secrets were never told, as to not give away that power. And as a result, false tellings or partial tellings are recorded for the annals of history and accepted as accurate, but are in fact great misunderstandings of African cultures, belief systems, and daily practices. Of course, it is also true that documentation was sometimes simply recorded in haste, was incomplete. There are many items in my own collection, for example, at the High, that do not have a specified date, but merely a century range, or there's no clear indication of the country or ethnic group an item was sourced from or belonged to, and so forth. So early items, sought or purchased or taken were misunderstood without much interest in seeking clarification, cross-referencing, or capturing detail, because the mission was to other or exoticize the creators and users of these objects, not to intimately understand them. And this accounts for a lot of the inaccuracies in African art collections, particularly among African art collected during this period. Colonial era museums, which defines most existing encyclopedic museums, have left records behind that are missing information and are based on best guesses that would be reinforced by other scholars with limited knowledge of this ethnically dense continent. The late African art historian, Sidney Littlefield Cassirer, critiqued the field as being steeped in internal discourse where false ideas are perpetuated because they lack African input and interpretations, and thus the field established networks of, quote, tightly knit inner coherence, where participants validate one another's research, all born of things oversimplified and or fictional. And these points are well taken. But African agency also plays a role in these misunderstandings. Providing false information and employing doublespeak or allegories that can only be understood in proper cultural context are all acts of subversion and protest that worked. The truth is, sometimes in museum collections, we really don't know what we're looking at. Secrecy features prominently in African epistemologies with regard to social orders, religious rites, rituals of coming of age and marriage, for example. There is often secrecy among certain groups in the same community. The owners of secrets have power and they regulate access to this power through revealing and teaching specified groups of people at specified times in their life. If there exists a systemized practice of speaking indirectly about particular subjects in life and in ritual, or altogether concealing certain aspects of these things from people in one's own community, it is logical that the intended function of sacred objects, for example, would be concealed from foreigners as well. Perhaps especially foreigners invading one's land and installing systems of labor exploitation and oppression. Refusal to share these secrets with Europeans, revealing the truth of an object's power or function, was a powerful act of protection and resistance. Shifting gears now to the second and final part of my discussion, I'll be focusing on notions of authenticity in Western art markets and institutions. I'm engaging questions regarding who creates meaning for art in general and for African art in particular. It is important to interrogate who and what entities define cultural authenticity, and furthermore, why these perceptions of so-called authenticity are important at all. In the African art field, there are strong notions of the quote-unquote traditional, and on the opposing side, the quote-unquote made-for-sale art. And made-for-sale art, sometimes called tourism art, is a disparaging term in the field. It implies that a work of art is both less valuable and not quite real. But in truth, the differences between these two categories is quite gray and inconsistently defined by the tastemakers. That would be brokers, auction houses, collectors, and even museums that define what is authentic and therefore desirable. Before I discuss art made for purchase, I want to first mention the concept of purity and how it factors into this. There is an imagined untouched pre-colonial Africa. That is to say, it has been stated that traditional African art is art that is uninfluenced by outsiders. But this notion is erroneous and doesn't actually line up with what we find in collections and auction houses when they put something on display that is said to be authentic. On the contrary, African objects labeled traditional often were created using materials sourced beyond the local or immediate environment and feature non-indigenous woods, other materials, and so forth. Intra-continental trade routes, as well as global trade routes, have connected the African continent to itself, as well as with Southern Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, and India for thousands of years before Western European settlement. And artworks reflect these influences in design as well as in material, just as Africa has influenced each of the regions previously mentioned. Also, objects and artwork defined as authentic are sometimes positioned as the remnants of disappearing, almost mythical cultures of the past, particularly rare. But in fact, most of the ethnic groups not only still exist, but thrive and continue to create the very same objects and use them in the same ways in ceremony and in their daily lives. The exclusion of the voices of people who created and are represented by such objects in material culture, and the persistence of what Caspar referred to as networks of tightly knit intercoherence have produced misleading, or in some cases completely inaccurate, historical narratives. And today we find a continued emphasis on othering rather than understanding that drives sales and signals to broader audiences, not just collectors, what is important and what is not regarding Africa. Lastly, authenticity is said to suggest that the object was used in a functional or spiritual manner by the society that created it. So in addition to being untouched and not externally influenced, it is said to have been made for purpose, not consumption. And this is importantly completely untrue. African entrepreneurs quickly learned of the aesthetic tastes and preferences of Europeans and began mass producing objects, especially masks and wooden figurative sculptures that appealed to Europeans with the intention of selling them or trading them to Europeans as decorative objects. This practice began even before formal governments were established in the colonies, when missionaries arrived on the continent, as well as during the time the Portuguese had forts set up along the coastline for resupply stops on their long voyages to the Far East. And the practice of making items to sell to or trade with Europeans and their relatives and visitors only became more commonplace under colonial rule. So not only do African collections sometimes reflect European tastes due to the fact the objects have tended to be collected by Europeans, so they're selecting the objects, and then once again, selected for display or sale, commonly by Europeans, but they also reflect the taste of Europeans because Africans have explicitly made these objects for European buyers. Collections tell us more about European thought about Africans, what they were interested in about Africa, or what they wanted to remember of Africa, than they do African aesthetic preferences or present balanced representations of African life. And these made-for-sale decorative objects are in many collections and are labeled authentic. I'll finish as I started with another story, one that exemplifies inconsistencies in how African art is defined. In the early colonial era, a Burkinabe village that was missionized, it's actually pre-formal colonial era, and they began producing products, small figurative sculptures, to sell. And they were collected and purchased to benefit the community. And these items were not labeled inauthentic by the museums that began collecting them and still hold them. Later, however, the same village becomes a Peace Corps site, and a Peace Corps project designed to engage the artists in the continued production of the same objects made by the same people took place, and soon these figurative sculptures came to be considered inauthentic tourism art, and they stopped being collected. And while it is a rule of the market that the increased quantity or accessibility of an item would diminish its purchasing value, it is important not to conflate the market with notions of authenticity. The village later became a tourist destination, likely in no small part because of the art-making culture that had been established there for so long. I think the example of this village makes it clear how fickle the choice of labels and the values assigned to works can be. At times, it seems to be considered authentic and or valuable, that to be considered authentic or valuable is a complex code that only certain people hold the keys to. But it may actually be quite simple. The qualifications for African historical and cultural artifacts and artwork to be considered preferable and authentic is if the gatekeepers say so. And I say this not to devalue what is in a museum. I've had this conversation with people who will say, well, if you're certain that this object on display or this beautiful object that you sold for all this money at an auction house was just made for consumption, are you saying that everything in the museum or this object in particular that was sold isn't as valuable? And actually, it's the opposite. I'm insisting that it's incredibly valuable due to its aesthetic offerings and the incredible craftsmanship and generations of passed down skill in all different media, metalworking, wood, beadwork, and that alone is impressive. We don't need to create a fiction for it. I really want to push up against the notion that it's only interesting if we can attach this mythology, this idea of this pure mythical exotic Africa to it, and that we should celebrate it for what it has to offer in the art world, just as we do objects from other departments. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lauren, for your wonderful presentation. And now we are about to begin the question and answer session, which I will do with both of you at the same time. So I would like to begin by first asking you both to discuss kind of this problem of aesthetic categorization and the relationship with Western colonial histories that you each cite in different ways in your papers. And specifically, my question is, why do you think this challenge of categorization and engagement with African art persists, even though we have come quite a long ways from the colonial period, and these critiques have been within the field in the art world now for at least 3 or 4 decades? Which one of you would like to begin?
Lauren, you can.
Okay.
Why do I think it persists? I mean, as my title suggests, I really think that it's unfortunately, it's still an effective branding tool. And I think, again, I'm interested in this work because it really worries this concept that what's interesting about Africa is some imagined untouched past, and that it almost implies that there's nothing happening now, right? And I think that it will, hopefully, I'm being optimistic here, but I think that will probably eventually change as the incredible contemporary African art, I think, renaissance that's happening in multiple cities across the continent right now. We had an incredible sort of African cultural renaissance after the fall of colonialism and the modernist art movement. And these things always come in cycles. And so I think we're having another one. And hopefully it'll stick a little longer this time and people will start to get engaged and have a better sense of being able to imagine Africa in the present and in the future. And it won't keep being stuck in the past.
Okay. What about you, Emmanuel? What do you think?
Alors, moi, je pense que si ces catégories existent, c'est qu'elles servent encore un certain nombre de structures institutionnelles. Elles servent aussi le marché de l'art, surtout. Et puis, elles sont aussi inscrites dans l'organisation des savoirs, et notamment des savoirs scientifiques, mais aussi dans les imaginaires collectifs, et effectivement de manière très forte, quoi. Mais en même temps, je rejoins Laurine en disant qu'aujourd'hui, il y a de nombreuses initiatives, non seulement peut-être chez les artistes africains, mais aussi dans les musées. Et il y a beaucoup de musées qui cherchent à rompre ces visions. En tout cas, en Europe, on voit notamment tout un travail en Allemagne qui est fait et qui est intéressant. Et puis, j'ai lu dernièrement l'ouvrage de Clémentine Delis qui s'appelle The Metabolic Museum et qui revient sur son expérience à Francfort où elle avait essayé de travailler avec cette idée de musée post-ethnographique et qui est absolument magnifique et assez intéressant, quoi. Donc,
je peux vous
pardon.
traduire là. Of course, I think that this challenge still exists because these categories are still carried by institutional structures, by the art market, but also by the organization of scientific knowledge and collective imagination. Luckily, I would join Lauren in saying that there are numerous initiatives, notably in museums, and I've seen this in Europe, particularly there's some great initiatives in Germany, work being done to try to break with this approach. And recently I read a fascinating book by Clémentine Delis, The Metabolic Museum, which comes back to this notion of the post-ethnographic museum and really explains in a fascinating way the work that she did in that direction in Frankfurt.
Merci. Et je pense aussi qu'il faut poursuivre en fait tout le travail d'analyse que faisait par exemple Laurine et montrer la complexité des faits historiques, sociaux, culturels, esthétiques et en finir avec un certain nombre de poncifs et de clichés. Et c'est aussi par l'étude et l'analyse de certains cas qu'on va pouvoir le faire. Alors j'avais envie de revenir sur la complexité du statut des masques avec un article de Julien Bondaz qui a réfléchi notamment au statut des antiquaires ouest-africains et particulièrement au Sénégal, et qui s'intitule « L'art de profiler les objets chez les antiquaires ouest-africains », qui est un article qui est paru dans la revue Gradiva.
Merci, je vais traduire. It does seem to me that we have to continue the analytical work that Lauren is engaged in, for instance, and show the complexity of the historical, social, cultural, and aesthetic facts, and also really move away from the cliches. And we can do that by studying specific cases. That's something that I wanted to do today, to return to the complexity of the status of masks, notably by mentioning an article by Julien Bondaz, which looks specifically at antique dealers in West Africa, notably in Senegal. His article is called, I'm translating the title into English, The Merchant Character of the Fetish and Its Secret, the art of profiling objects among West African antique dealers. And this article was published in the journal Gradiva.
Et donc, dans cet article, en fait, Bondaz revient sur le rôle des antiquaires africains qui est souvent dévalorisé, et dévalorisé notamment par les vendeurs occidentaux et aussi par les collectionneurs, et qui sont souvent accusés de tromperie, de vieillir les objets, d'inventer des récits et de faire un art pour touristes, et qui sont aussi souvent présentés comme des faux experts.
So in this article, Bondaz looks at the role of African antique dealers, which has often been belittled, and particularly belittled by Western art dealers. They accuse African art dealers often of deceit, of trying to age the objects, of making up stories around their provenance, of selling art for tourists. And so these African art dealers are presented as false experts.
Et ce que ne veut pas faire Bondaz, c'est juger en fait cette profession, mais plutôt montrer comment ces antiquaires participent à la transformation d'objets magico-rituels en marchandises et en œuvres d'art. Mais il va plus loin aussi. Il veut montrer que le commerce de ces objets et le fait de les rendre précieux aux collectionneurs ne se réduit pas à la à transférer ces objets de la sphère rituelle à la sphère marchande. Il dit, il s'agit au contraire d'entretenir la multiplicité ontologique des biens, afin de profiler leur qualité marchande de manière la plus adéquate.
So what Bondaz wants to avoid doing is to judge this profession. So he shows how these dealers participate in the transformation of magic ritual objects into works of art. He goes further too by showing that what the dealers do cannot be reduced to transferring something from the ritual sphere to the merchant sphere. On the contrary, what they're doing, and this is how he describes it, is maintaining the ontological multiplicity of goods in order to profile the merchant qualities in the most adequate manner.
Et donc, il a analysé le vocabulaire qu'ils utilisent et il a notamment montré qu'ils utilisent beaucoup le terme de fétiche. Donc, qui est une notion qui n'est plus utilisée par les historiens de l'art aujourd'hui ou par les ethnologues, parce que c'était une notion coloniale, en fait, utilisée par les colons. Et il voit qu'autour de cette notion de fétiche se jouent deux stratégies. Soit les antiquaires l'utilisent pour déprécier les objets, soit les antiquaires les utilisent pour, au contraire, apprécier les objets.
So he analyzes the vocabulary that these art dealers use, and he finds in particular that they use the term fetish a great deal. Now, that is a word that is no longer used by art historians today because it is related to colonial history. It has a colonial impact. And what Bondaz finds is that in using this word fetish, art dealers have two strategies. One is to depreciate the work of art, and the other is to appreciate it.
Et en fonction du contexte, en fonction de leurs interlocuteurs, les antiquaires insistent sur la distinction entre la sphère magico-rituelle et le marché de l'art, ou au contraire sur les affinités entre leurs propres compétences et celles des féticheurs, et ou encore sur les relations entre marchandises et fétiches, les relations qui ont notamment été analysées par Karl Marx.
I'd like to follow up.
Should I just translate that? Sorry.
Yeah, translate it. Okay.
So based on the context of who they're talking to, these dealers will either insist on the one hand on the distinction between the magic ritual aspect of the object and its art object, or they will perhaps insist on the relationship between merchandise and fetish, as Karl Marx would have used.
Donc voilà, ce que je trouve intéressant dans son travail, c'est qu'il montre que ce terme de fétiche permet en fait de produire de la valeur encore aujourd'hui à leur manière, et puis de faire fonctionner les objets à la fois comme objets rituels, comme marchandises et comme œuvres d'art.
I would like to know.
Sorry. Should I just translate? Sorry to do that again. What I find interesting about Bondaz's work is that he manages to show how the term fetish still today can produce value and is also able to make function the aspects of magic ritual, merchandise. Yes.
So as a follow-up for both of you, then I'm wondering to what extent we can disrupt what has been happening by using existing or emerging technologies to open up different audiences and kind of potential, I guess, collectors in other contexts or areas where we can reframe because the analyses are there and it's continuing to take place, but it seems that there's this kind of small cohort of people who, or kind of entities within this network that are controlling the discourse and the perception. So do you think that now, since we have expanded like our technological capacities to reach the world in much more different ways, that may be a way to disrupt what has been happening before?
Maurita, when you say technologies, do you mean, are you talking about like the internet? Are you talking about communication technologies? Are you talking about like ways to analyze the objects in the collections?
I'm referring to like internet, social media,
Okay.
as a beginning or just as an entry point. And if it's already being used, why do we think it's not having the reach that it potentially could to kind of transform the ways that people are interacting with African art?
I think the internet will definitely help with this in terms of spreading information. I just think the internet was such a huge cultural shift that happened relatively fast. And I think there's still a gap between the people who are really internet savvy and the people who are buying art. And so I think it's a generational thing that will change over time as people who can engage in art, collect art, work in museums, institutions, universities, begin to have access to, sorry about that, begin to have the ability to have this kind of impact in terms of what is imagined and the sort of complete canon of scholarship on these things.
In regards to your work as a curator and a museum professional, Lauren, to what extent do you think we can, or what types of strategies, I guess, or curatorial strategies do you think should be utilized so that we can rectify or to correct some of the historical misunderstandings that you referenced in your, I don't want to call them anecdotes, in your stories that you revealed about your experiences with people who could see the contradictions and the inaccuracies in existing texts?
Yeah, I think about this all the time. I don't think this is a really ambitious goal. I don't think there's really a way to maybe even complete it. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't start it, but I think we have to audit the entire thing. I think we have to start all over. We have, you know, and especially in some institutions, such large collections that were just collected in haste, and the you know, sort of intentional misinformation. And it's like we're backlogged. We have to go back and like re-engage these communities in a new way. And like you said a moment ago, like technology will allow us to do that perhaps better than any other time in human history. But I think we have to like slowly audit. And I think that's a very slow long-term goal. I think the more immediate thing that we can do is just be honest about the inaccuracies and say, hey, we don't know, you know, or this information is missing. Sometimes, you know, provenance is just that you get to a dead end really quickly. And just let people know that, like, we don't actually know where this is from. You know, we are trying to pursue, especially where things might be, where there might be some illicit trafficking concerns or things like looting, particularly violent incidences that resulted in, you know, taking particularly precious artifacts, that we are doing our due diligence to go back and however we can do a little bit of investigating to find out where these things came from, or if it was a part of that. And just, again, being transparent about the fact that, you know, a lot of the damage was done, and a lot of the damage was done 100 years ago or more. And so it's just, some questions will not be answered, and we need to make peace with that. That doesn't mean that we don't pursue it, but we certainly should start off, because that journey is so long, just being honest about what we don't know.
Thank you. Emmanuelle, I actually want to shift the conversation to the contemporary artists that you mentioned and some of the work that we're doing. First, by bringing to your attention one of the questions that was in the chat. There was a request that the names of the artists be typed into the chat for the audiences, for people who may be interested in doing their own research or looking them up. So just to first begin there.
Donc, il s'agit de Hervé Youmbi. Ça?
Okay. 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 And after that, my next thing that I'd like for you to discuss is, in many ways, like you brought to our attention a new kind of way of working for this contemporary artist, where there's a lot of back and forth, and kind of, as you talked about, this life cycle for the artist in ways that seem to be relatively unusual. And I'm wondering to what extent you think this may be a mechanism that other contemporary artists can use so that they can reach both Western audiences and museum and gallery spaces that exist even on the continent, as well as giving access to works or to experiences still in the communities and having it kind of, so they can serve multiple communities at once. Like, is this a model that you believe others should be emulating?
Je ne crois pas au modèle. Je crois qu'il y a des stratégies personnelles, des stratégies toujours à renouveler et qu'il faut toujours rejouer avec le système parce que ce système est anthropophage en fait et réussit à intégrer la critique et la subversion très vite.
Okay.
I'm going to translate in just a second, taking a note. And yeah, I don't believe in models. I believe in personal strategies that constantly have to be renewed. You have to play with the system because the system is anthropogynous. It is critical and subversive.
Bon, ça peut être aussi des stratégies collectives, mais elles ont toujours besoin de se réinventer en fait. Mais ce qui m'intéresse aussi avec Hervé Youmbi, c'était de montrer comment il essaye de brouiller les catégories, ce que j'ai fait tout à l'heure, mais il brouille aussi, et en tout cas, il agit aussi ailleurs, parce que son travail, forcément, a des impacts à la fois sur les communautés locales. Donc, j'ai mentionné le fait que les œuvres pouvaient être utilisées lors de rituels. Et donc, ce serait intéressant de mieux comprendre comment ça se passe, qu'est-ce qui est en jeu, qu'est-ce qui se trame dans ces processus.
There can, of course, also be collective strategies, but these always need to be reinvented and renewed. What interested me in the case of Hervé Youmbi is that he blurs categories, he scrambles categories, and also he's active elsewhere. For instance, it would be interesting to look at the impact that his work has on local communities. As I mentioned before, he uses ritual. So it would be interesting to see what happens in those cases and what processes are in play.
Mais il y a eu aussi un deuxième enjeu pour les communautés locales, c'est que ces objets ont beaucoup plu. Ils ont plu pendant les performances rituelles, mais ils ont plu aussi aux artisans qui se sont mis à produire en fait des répliques, produire des copies de ces sculptures. Donc ça aussi, ce serait à observer. Et Youmbi a essayé de travailler avec ces artisans, notamment quand les artisans ont aussi constaté que le marché de l'art contemporain s'intéressait aux pièces de Youmbi.
So there's also a second issue for the local community, which is that these objects prove to be very popular with the local community, not only with the people who saw them in the rituals, but also local craftsmen liked them and started to make copies and replicas of the statues. So that's something that would also be interesting to observe. And in fact, Youmbi tried to work with these craftsmen, notably when it was discovered that the contemporary art market was interested in these works.
Et puis, il y a aussi autre chose, c'est que Youmbi a beaucoup investi sur des modes collectifs au Cameroun. Et donc, il fait partie d'une génération d'artistes qui réinvestit son énergie dans des initiatives camerounaises. Donc, des lieux d'art, des lieux d'enseignement qui correspondent aussi aux réalités locales et aux besoins des étudiants, etc.
there's another thing, which is that Yumbi has invested a great deal in collective modes in Cameroon. So he's part of a generation that has really reintegrated the collective, whether that is through specific locations, art institutions, schools that really meet the needs, notably of students.
Alors, je ne sais pas si son travail peut échapper aux logiques du marché et au phénomène d'art global, mais en tout cas, comme tout art conceptuel, il essaye de révéler des logiques dominantes et d'agir. C'est un jeu assez difficile, un peu dangereux. Mais ce qui m'intéresse aussi, c'est que sa démarche montre qu'il y a une réception de l'art en Afrique et évidemment des processus locaux de thésaurisation, c'est-à-dire on gagne de l'argent, quoi. Et finalement, sa démarche, elle essaye de déplacer aussi à sa manière le centre de gravité de l'art. Et elle montre évidemment que l'Occident n'est pas le seul producteur ni des valeurs, ni d'une économie de l'art. Aussi bien pour l'art ancien que pour l'art contemporain.
So I don't know if Hervé Yumbi's work can escape market logic. That remains to be seen. But like all conceptual art, it aims to reveal the dominant logic and also to actually act. That's a dangerous game to play, but it does show, it has succeeded in showing that there is a reception for the art in Africa, that the art can make money. And I think what he's trying to do is to move the gravitational center of the art world and show that it doesn't have to be located in a specific place in the West, and that it can be elsewhere, both in terms of values and economy, both in terms of old artists and new artists.
I think these are really interesting points that have been made, and noticing Lauren's facial gestures, just some of it along with mine. I would love for her to weigh in, not just because of her facial expressions, but also her expertise in the area, to kind of give her insight into what Emmanuel has been saying about Hervé Yumbi and like his impact on other local artists and the contemporary art scene as well.
First, I want to say that I kind of want to respond to the last question you asked me directly, and also the question posed before that kind of at once. You were speaking about how do we start correcting some of these inaccuracies. And then before, I think you were asking about technology. And I think shared databases, if those really start to become implemented, things like blockchain and other developments will help us crowdsource all of these inaccuracies and all this information, and we can all update and sort of get there a lot faster. I still think that it would take a long time, and I actually think that we're still a long way from having an implementable version of that. But I think that that's a real sort of thing to look forward to in terms of technology and the inaccuracies we spent sort of the first couple of questions discussing. And then with regard to this conversation on this wonderful artist, did you have a specific question that you wanted to ask me, Maurita?
Noticed that there is a section where she was talking about how this artist impacted other artists who began to copy the practices, and then it began to filter into the market. And then ultimately it began to have a differential impact on the kind of the art scene of the contemporary art scene in general. And to me, that really speaks volumes to the ways in which these levels of exchange and things, the ways that kind of traditions are continually evolving and kind of growing even in unanticipated ways. It may have always been so. So I was really curious in light of some of the things that you pointed out, like what,
I think you probably saw my face light up because I was, I'm of course really interested in the complexity of people duplicating things that aren't quote unquote indigenous to them or what have you. But I think you might have seen me smile when she was discussing how there's a local market for these objects. I think that that's how you start to change the conversation in some really important ways as well, that you're not, since, I think that Burkinabe village that I was citing earlier was established in like 1901. I mean, so for, 120 years, people have been in dialogue with Europe. And there's this idea that that's how you earn a living as an artist or craftsperson. And I love this changing tide of people just making work for their own community in really meaningful ways, and artists being able to make a living selling their work locally and having a really incredible impact. I have a friend, another one. I don't say their names because I don't know how comfortable they'd be, but who was an artist and started to really have an incredible career in Europe, and had his work in shows in Switzerland and Germany and the Netherlands. And right as he was starting to kind of peak, he went back to the continent and started a school and like an academy for all the incredibly talented artists that he could find locally. And what's happened really quickly in like just shy of 15 years is that now there's this booming arts ecology there. And so I'm just really excited by the reverse brain drain that is starting to happen, if you will, because he could have had a successful career in Europe and just stayed there. He was right about to break. And he said, you know what? I'm going to go back home. And it wasn't that he was going back home to like teach them how to be artists. The local community's been incredibly talented. He was going back home to teach them other things that he'd learned about how to promote art, how to write an artist statement. This is the language of grants. This is how you can get a residency. This is a thing that exists for you so that you can go and just workshop things. This is how you can start to engage with an international art community from your own home and bring that back to our city. And so I think that that's just really this sort of autonomy that this implies is coming, I think is really exciting. That Africa can engage with the rest of the world when it wants to is something that I look forward to.
I think this kind of conversation about the possibilities for the future are very interesting, and also kind of lead me back to the second artist presented by Emmanuelle to ask about, to what extent does this notion of mutant mask, how does it fit within these conversations that people have about Afrofutures and Afrofuturism? Like, do you think this is an apt way of thinking about it? Or is this another part, or could this be another kind of limited categorization in structural violence?
Alors, en fait, par exemple, au Sénégal, puisque moi je travaille beaucoup au Sénégal depuis de longues années, le terme d'afrofuturisme n'est pratiquement pas utilisé. Peut-être un peu en musique chez certains musiciens, mais dans le champ des arts plastiques, l'afrofuturisme ou la question même aussi d'une vision du futur par la science-fiction ou des choses comme ça, c'est très peu présent. Mais par contre, la question du futurisme est posée depuis longtemps. Elle a été évidemment posée par les indépendances et les luttes après les indépendances et pour les indépendances. Et puis, elle avait notamment été évoquée par Senghor, qui lui-même a créé une école qu'il appelait l'Université des Mutants à Gorée, dans la fin des années 70, et qui correspondait en fait à cette volonté aussi d'inventer une Afrique libre, vraiment, pas dépendante, avec un certain nombre d'intellectuels qui étaient invités à participer à cette université et qui étaient des intellectuels du monde entier, notamment des Américains du Sud, des Africains, des Cubains, etc., et qui avaient à voir finalement avec toute l'idéologie de la tricontinentale.
Pardon, le nom de l'université, vous avez bien dit l'université des mutants, j'ai bien entendu?
Oui.
D'accord. So I'm going to translate. If I take the example of Senegal, for example, which is a place where I've worked for many years, Afrofuturism is not particularly present as a concept, perhaps a little bit in music, but in visual art, the idea of Afrofuturism or a vision of the future through science fiction, those are really not very present at all. On the other hand, the question of futurism has existed for a very long time. It was raised by the African struggles for independence and the struggles that came after that. And it was also raised, for instance, by Senghor, who started a school called the University of Mutants in Gorée in the late 70s. And the idea for this university was really to participate in freeing Africa and making sure it would not be dependent. And this was a place for intellectuals from the whole world to be invited to come together. There were intellectuals from South America, Cubans, etc., really a place for tricontinental ideology to be expressed.
Donc, cette notion de mutant était présente dans les luttes, en fait. Alors, je pense qu'après, l'afrofuturisme est peut-être plus présent en Afrique du Sud, peut-être au Nigeria, etc. Mais en tout cas, moi, je crois au potentiel de l'afrofabulation, un terme qui a été énoncé par Talia Nyong'o. Et donc, je trouve que la fabulation offre une combinaison d'interventions imaginaires, permet des connaissances utopiques, oblige à penser, à réfléchir, à rêver, et que c'est aussi un moyen finalement d'engager d'autres histoires, de remettre en jeu en permanence l'histoire, de mettre aussi en évidence la violence de l'histoire, et puis finalement peut-être aussi de faire en sorte qu'il n'y a pas une histoire, mais il y en a plein, quoi. Ça rejoint un peu peut-être ce que disait Lauren tout à l'heure, il y a une pluralité de versions. Et c'est cette pluralité de versions qui constitue peut-être l'intérêt en fait, du travail à mener.
So the notion of mutants has been present since the struggles for independence. I think Afrofuturism perhaps has been more present in countries of Southern Africa, like Nigeria. But what I do believe in is the power of Afrofabulation, which is a term that's been used by Tavia Nyong'o, because fabulation offers us a combination of imaginary interventions, utopian knowledge. It forces us to think, reflect, and dream. And it's a way, perhaps this joins what Lauren was saying earlier, it's a way of showing that it's not just one story, but many stories, and that there is a plurality of versions, and perhaps that's where the work remains to be done.
Thank you. It is my understanding we only have a few minutes left. And so I wanted to make sure that we at least acknowledge some of the questions that were presented that I did not see before. So please excuse me for not noting that earlier. But there was a question about NFTs. What specifically the question was, how do you feel about NFT art compared to actual art, and it's selling quicker than real art? And is this applicable to the situation with contemporary African art? Or how could, to what extent could it be a part of this discourse or discussion about African art?
I actually have to admit that I haven't given a lot of thought to NFTs. So I don't know, Emmanuelle, if you have something to offer.
It's not my topic.
Are there any questions that you would like to ask each other, or things that you would like to bring up that I haven't brought to your attention?
I just want to make a comment. I think this is a perfect way to end, actually, that it was an honor to be on this panel with all of you wonderful, wonderful scholars.
Merci aussi, c'était très bien. J'étais très contente d'entendre Lauren aussi dans ce qu'elle explique et la complexité de la relation à l'histoire qu'elle exprime.
Thank you very much. It was really very interesting. And I have to say, I was really happy to hear Lauren and how she explains the complexity of what she's relating to.
Well, I would say thank you all for this wonderful conversation, and I look forward to getting to know more about your work in the future. It was an honor to be able to moderate it.
Merci beaucoup, Maurita.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.